We are now coming down to close to the end of a series in which we've been talking about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and the way that they have acted and things that they have done upon this earth. And so today, we come down to pick up our story where we left off last week. And that is, as we look at this chart, it says God still provides for us with all of the awesome power that He ever had. In our last lesson, we basically dealt with one thing, and that is that God has miraculous power. He created the heavens and the earth by miracles, and He has done 1,000 other things by miracles. But the same God who created the universe miraculously also set in all of the natural laws miraculously. After it was all created, our Father gave orders to this universe, not only the thinking creatures, but also to every other thing, to the stars, the sun, the moon, and the ocean, and He told them to stay where you are and to behave in a certain way. So when we get to dealing with natural law, from our mind, the human mind, we get to thinking that we're dealing with something that's just everyday stuff. And it is, because we see it operating every day without any addition, without any subtraction from it. But we forget that it was our God that set this into action. And then our God uses these things to do certain things for us. Now, for every miracle God has done, He has cared for His people in 1,000 billion more times using natural law. Obviously, I don't know the number, but all I can say is that if you will read your Bible from Genesis to Revelation, you will begin reading and you will find a miracle. Then you're going to find 100 other little things that God has done without miracles. And then you'll find a miracle. And then you're going to find a whole lot more that God has done without miracles. Then you'll find a miracle. So my whole point is that if you were to go back and you were to look at everything that God has done since the creation of man, you would find that God has cared for man in two ways. He has cared for us by performing miracles at certain times, but as I pointed here to try to make a point, 1,000 billion more times, He has used His natural law to care for you and me. Now, we think of the Bible as full of miracles, and it is. But it has much more teaching about the workings in natural law. That if we were to go back and we look and we see, okay, what all has God done, far, far more do we find that He has done through natural law than He has done in a miraculous way. My whole point that I want us to see at this time in this particular series is this, that when we look at what God has done, God has these two avenues of His divine power in order to bring things to pass. Now, we're going to study today various things that have happened in a natural way. And yet it is so very clear that every human being that's ever read their Bible understands that it is God that is working these things. So today, our lesson will be the Bible and God's providence. We bring that new word into existence today because it is an important word. And that is, as we begin to look at God's providence, we see it is a unique word. The word providence is a word that man uses to describe God's working in our lives outside of the realm of miracles. That when God does something for human beings, but He doesn't use miracles, we say, well, what does He use? Well, I don't know. He uses natural law, and he uses His divine power through this natural law to see that certain things happen. And so man has coined a word. And Webster describes that word as an act of providing or preparation. It's foresight and care. It's the foresight and care of God for His creatures. a manifestation of God's care over His creatures, an event divinely ordained. It's where you look and you see these events that have happened. They're not miracles, but God is behind them. And you can see God's working just as plainly as you would see it in a miracle. As you look at certain things happening of where God might control the weather, and Jesus might look up at a storm out on the Sea of Galilee and say, "Peace, be still," and the storm just, psh. You say, well, that's a miracle. That goes against the natural laws as we know them, and that's right. But so oftentimes we find that God uses the other ways, and we say it's just as evident that it is God behind all of this. Now, I want us to notice that this is man's distinction and not God's. The distinction has had an unfortunate consequence. Now, it makes us think, and here's the bad thing. It makes us think if it is a miracle, then God is working. But if it's done by natural law, then God's not involved. That's how we settle down. That's how we all begin to think. And we begin to think, well, if before I can say God is doing something, I would have to see a miracle. And so we've coined this word, providence, to talk about the other power that God uses. So now, as we continue, I want us to note the Bible makes no such distinctions. Excuse me. I think this is unique. As you take your Bible and you begin to read through it, you begin to read that all that God has done. And as you read, when you get through, you don't find the word providence. It's not there. You don't find any word that says, now, this is what we're going to call it if God is working through natural law. Now, it's so very evident that God is working, as we're going to see. So man has coined the word. Man has said, well, it's God's providence, God providing for us through the means of this natural law. So let's look at some examples today and see how you feel about God. As we look at this, I'm going to ask you, was He really working? Was God involved? Or did these things just happen? I'm going to give you some examples today of where there's no miracles involved. No miracles whatsoever. And when we get through, I want you to look and I want you to just answer the question for yourself. Okay, was God involved? Did God provide anything in these particular ways? Can we really put our confidence in the fact that God provides for man, actually provides for man by using these natural laws? Now let's set the stage for Abraham, Isaac, and Rebekah. We haven't talked about these three. So let's take a look for just a moment. Abraham became an old man, and it's time to pick a wife for Isaac. So Genesis tells us that Abraham called his oldest servant, and he said, now you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell. I don't want Isaac to marry any of these heathen women around here in which we're living. But you shall go to my country. Now that's way back over the other side of Babylon in the Ur of the Chaldees. So you to go to my country and to my family and take a wife for my son Isaac. I want you to go all the way back and pick a wife. And the servant said to him, perhaps the woman will not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I take your son back to the land from which you came? So he's a smart servant. He said, suppose that I go back and I walk in and I pick out the wife and I say, hey, you, I want you to come back and marry Isaac. Suppose that woman says, no, I'm not leaving my family. I'm not leaving my homeland and going back into a country I don't know anything about and get married to a man that I never knew anything about. I'm not going back. So I said, now suppose that happens. Well, Abraham said unto him, beware that you take not my son back there. Now you see, Abraham was a dad who had a problem just like dads do today. Who do I want my boy to marry? Well, I don't want them to marry the heathens that we're living among, go out and marry these sinners, these heathens, these idolaters. He said, I don't want to do that. And I don't want you to just take him back over there. Don't you just pick up Isaac and take him over to the Ur of the Chaldees, because there's nothing but a bunch of heathens over there. So no, don't take him over there, because he'd probably go over there and get bogged down and stay. He'd probably find his family life, and he would stay, and it would ruin everything. So nope, nope. Don't you pick a woman here. You go over there and pick a woman over there, and don't you take him over there to look at her. Now there's a job. How would you like to have that job? So Abraham told him, he said, he will send his angel before you. He told the servant, he said, now God will send his angel before you. Stop, just stop right there. Suppose you'd have been that servant. How many angels did you ever saw? None. How many times did this ever happen to you? None. Do angels work in the affairs of men? I don't know. All I know is I've got a job to do, and I know that I got to go pick a wife out way over there in a foreign country. I got to pick her out, bring her over here, and she's going to marry Isaac, and I can't take him over to look her over, and I can't let him marry over here, and I've got a problem. Because the chances are she's not going to want to come back over here with me. So Abraham says, no, let's get one thing straight. He will send his angel before you. Don't you forget that angel. Before the series is over, we're going to get back to him. He said, and you shall take a wife for my son from there, and if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be released from this oath, only do not take my son back there. So if she won't come, then you're released then. Now, did Abraham think that something might happen where he'd be able to bring this young woman back? Well, this servant goes over. Now, I want you to put the picture in there. It's taken him several days. It's taken him a month or two to go way up and clear over on the other side of Babylon, over in the Ur of the Chaldees, and get over there back into the city and the place where Abraham lived, and up there in the tribes of where he came from. And he then comes and he doesn't know what woman to pick. He has no idea, so he prays to God. And his prayer is, now let it be that the young woman to whom I say, please let down your pitcher that I may drink, and she says, drink, and I will also give your camels to drink. Let her be the one you have appointed for your servant Isaac, and by this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. Now he said, Lord, I'm going to go out here by this well. And every evening all of the girls come out and they bring their pitcher on top of their head. And they come out and they get water to take back in for the cooking water. Now let it be, Lord, when I ask one of these girls, would you give me a drink? And she has to reach up and take the pitcher off of her head. Now this is a big pitcher. See, this is one of those 3, 4, 5 gallon pitchers you see them carrying. She has to take it off of her head and put it down and get me a drink. Chances are she's going to be like most women would say, just look at him and turn and go on. But he said, now let it be, if she does that, that's the one. And it happened before he'd finished speaking, that behold, Rebekah, who was born of Bethuel, the son of Melchiah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her pitcher on her shoulder. Now the young woman was very beautiful to behold, and virgin, and no man had known her. And she went up to the well and filled her pitcher and came up. So she got this big 5 gallons carrying on her head. And the servant ran to meet her and said, "Please let me drink a little water from your pitcher." That's kind of odd for a man to do. Lady, would you reach up and take that 5-gallon pitcher off of your head and put it down here and let me have a little water? So he ran up and he asked her, and so she said, "Drink, my lord." And then she quickly let her pitcher down to her hand and gave him to drink. And when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I will draw water for your camels also until they finish drinking." So, wow, it's working out. Now, I want to ask you a secret. Where's the miracle? Where's the miracle so far? Pick it out. You said, "Well, there's no miracle." Now, the guy's going over, and he's prayed to the Lord a certain thing, and here's a woman that gave the guy a drink. There's no miracle there so far. Now, do you think that God was involved without a miracle? The guy goes back and says, "May I go back?" And he went back and asked her, "Would you come back to this foreign land and marry this guy by the name of Isaac?" And she goes in and talks to her daddy, and her daddy says, "Okay." And evidently he was a real nice guy because he was trying to get Isaac to stay there. This is probably the reason Abraham wouldn't let him go over. It was because he would get involved with his daddy-in-law and never want to leave. And so they talk about it, and finally this servant says, "I have to go." And he brings Rebekah back, and she marries Isaac. Now, do you see any miracles? Anybody in here see the hand of God in this? Did God choose a wife for Isaac? Every person who's ever read that story says, yeah, God chose that woman. Joseph is an excellent example. As we look at Joseph, you remember that young man, kind of a spoiled young man. I expect we would all call him a brat had we lived back there at that time, because he was his daddy's favorite. Now, you remember his dad had 12 boys. He was one of them. He was the youngest, and he was the favorite. His mother had died in childbirth, and Abraham had babied him. And so here you have the little baby, and he grows up, and what does his daddy do? Well, his daddy buys him a coat of many colors. In other words, his daddy now gets him some things he hadn't given to the other boys. We're going to pamper this little fella. We're going to really give him some extra attention. Then Joseph had a couple of dreams, and he didn't keep them to himself. He came back and he told his family, he said, "You know, I had a dream. I had a dream the other day, and in my dream," and then he told about the sun and the moon coming, or the stars and the sun, moon coming, and bowing down before him who was a real bright light. And he said, "All these lights bowed down before me." And he had another the same thing. His brothers are already fed up with this little, what shall we call him, brat? Spoiled little kid. They're fed up with him. He really thinks he's something. Here it is, he's the youngest among us, and he gets all the good stuff. And now then, he's coming in, and he's saying, "You know, I'm dreaming that all of you guys are going to serve me. Isn't that a great dream? Wouldn't you like for your brothers and sisters to dream that and come and tell you, be haughty enough to actually tell you, here's what you're going to do to bow down to me?" And of course, they're sick of him. They go out to take care of their sheep a few miles away. They didn't get back in time for the dad to really be concerned about him. So he said, "I want you to go down and I want you to check on your brothers. Go down and see if there's anything that's wrong with them." So he sends them down to that. Now, do you see God's hand in this anywhere now? You say, "Oh yeah, here's a miracle." No, go down and see them. Well, as they walked up, these 11 brothers were looking there, and they saw this little brat of a brother coming, and they were jealous, and they said, let's get him. So they made up plans, we'll get him. We're going to do away with him because we're not around Daddy now who can protect him. So they got down and they kidnapped him. They took him over and they threw him down a cistern. And so now he's there. This was one of the highlights of my trip over to Israel, and we didn't even stop to go see this thing. But we were coming back down the road, and there was a stoplight. We had to stop. While we're there, the guide said, look out the right side of the bus, and over here you see that cistern, you see that hole? That's where they threw Joseph. Now they said, it's out in this field. We know he was in this field because the Bible says between here and here, and there's only 2 of these in the field. Now, if it's not this one, it's the other one. So there it is. I look out and, wow. And there's a hole ground about that big around, and way down, and they dropped him down there. How would you like to be sitting down in that hole and just not enough room for your shoulders? You're just down there. You're kind of in, and you're looking up and higher than this room. How am I going to get out of here? So they got rid of him. So he's down there, but one brother didn't want to kill him. And so just at this time, there were some slave traders came along. Now, these were just ordinary, everyday merchants. They weren't like slave traders today. These were just a bunch of good guys that was going down into Egypt, and they dealt in these things. And so why not trade the kid, this boy says. This guy, one of the boys that wanted to save him. And so he made a deal. He said, we'll sell you this boy. They said, okay, we'll buy him. So they bought this little boy. They took him down to Egypt. That's down there. And so he got out of dying. Got the slave traders, got down there, and a guy by the name of Potiphar, who was a high-ranking man, bought him. Just everyday purchase. No shame about it. Just like buying a car, like buying a lawnmower, something that you're going to use. Now, Potiphar's wife was immoral. Lots of that happened. The other day I heard that last surveys taken, 50% of the married women have committed adultery in America. Just a pretty common thing. No big problems that we got here. And then, you know the dirty trick she pulled on him and got him thrown in jail. So he's thrown in prison. Then he gets down there, and a couple of guys have a dream, and they tell him about it. And Joseph said, well, here's what it's talking about. And then the king has a dream. Any of you ever had dreams? When you wake up, do you say, oh, a miracle last night? No. No, you have dreams. They had dreams. But these dreams turned out a little different. You know the story. How that finally there, one of them here then says, you know, I remember that there was a young guy down in jail when I was down there, and he interpreted my dream, and so the king called him up. The king called up Joseph and made him second in command over all of Egypt. And so now Joseph, going from that spoiled little kid his brothers hated and his father spoiled, has now become the head of Egypt. And then there was a famine. 7 years of famine, and this famine did away with all the crops and everything, and up in Israel, the famine was bad, and up where his dad and brothers were, they don't have any crops, and they're starving to death. Now, what do you do when you're starving to death? We start looking around. And they heard, you know, down in Egypt, there's a guy down there, and he stored up a whole bunch, and you can get all the food you want in Egypt. So his dad said, boys, take the buggy or take the wagon and go down and buy us some food. So they took the wagon, they went down, and they bought some food off of Joseph. Now, this is when Joseph saw him. It was a shock to him. Joseph, these are my brothers. Joseph goes in, of course, now he's growing up to be a big boy, and they don't recognize him because he was just a little kid. And he said, tell me about your dad and mom. So they started telling him. And so they told him about this and that, and he said, well, do you have another brother? Well, we had another brother, and then they told, the story about how they'd gone back and lied to the dad. And so the dad was just brokenhearted because he had lost his little boy, Joseph. And here's Joseph. And so for the first time, Joseph gets the picture, my daddy really loved me. My daddy didn't just give up on me. And so Joseph is brokenhearted. He excused himself, goes in and cries, gets his composure, comes back out, and then told him, go back. And the end of the story is, he said, I want you to get your daddy, bring him back, because he said, I am Joseph, your brother. Wow. When you look at that, his brothers were terrified. But they went back and got their dad, brought him down, and now you have Isaac and all of the 12 patriarchs. All of Israel now that's down there, they're down in Egypt. They're down in the only country that has any food. So Joseph puts them out there, gives them all this food. And now then, here it is, they have all this food. Now, back up a little bit. How important is it to save these boys? How important is it? You remember God called Abraham and he said, through thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed? God promised that it's through your nation, Abraham, and these are the only ones left out of Abraham's family. And they're brought down and they're fed and they're kept there until finally they were released and went back up. And these boys are scared to death. And now you ready for a conclusion? Anybody seen any miracles? No. Everything is just as natural as it can be. But Joseph tells his brothers, but now do not therefore be angry or grieved with yourself because you sold me. For God sent me before you to preserve life. What'd you say, Joseph? I said, God sent me before you to preserve life. Wait a minute, Joseph. That wasn't God. Don't you remember, Joseph, that your daddy bought you that coat of many colors that made all those boys so jealous? Don't you understand those stupid dreams you had and then you didn't have sense enough to keep them to yourself and you told your brothers and got them all mad at you? Don't you understand that's the reason they sold you down here to Egypt? Don't you understand that? God's not involved in this thing. Do I need to say any more? See, Joseph understood what was going on. He said, and God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Now I'd ask you a question. Do you think that God was involved without a miracle? You'd say that's absolutely unbelievable. This is just unbelievable the way that God worked here in his life. Last week we gave you this one. Paul makes his experience very clear. You remember he was in this city of Ephesus, and the people were ready to tear him apart. And as you look at it, here's the facts. The disciples came to Paul, and Paul was ready to go in, give his life. It was all over. He'd given up. But his disciples, the disciples came and said, no, don't go. We don't want you to go. Now, this is just a bunch of the brethren. That's all this is. It's just a bunch of the brethren that are there that said, no, don't go. And then the Asiarchs, who were over that amphitheater, they came to him and said, don't go. Don't go yet. Stay here. Well, he didn't want to see anybody else get hurt, so he'd given up. He said, I had the death sentence pronounced upon me. I was dead. It was all over. That's what he said. And then a town clerk got up and made a speech and quieted the crowd. And they all went home, and Paul lived. Now later, when Paul told this story in 2 Corinthians, he there is saying we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. And he considered just being raised from the dead, who delivered us from so great a death, and does deliver us, in whom we trust, and that he will deliver us. Paul said it was God that delivered me. Well, wait a minute, Paul. Paul, don't you understand it was just a bunch of the brethren that came and said, don't go? And then some of these heathen Asiarchs, they said, don't go. And then that politician, that town clerk, that lying, corrupt, political person, he got up and he made a speech. Where's God, Paul? That's the point I want to make. What did Paul say? He said it was God who delivered me. See? Now, we give other examples. We just go on and on and on. Remember the shipwreck that Paul was in? And how that he was out there and everybody and the owner of the boat and everybody says the boat is gone and here we have to do this. And Paul finally came and told him, he said, look, he said, just throw everything out of the boat. He said, there's not going to be anybody that's lost in here. He said, an angel stood by me tonight and told me that all of us are going to be saved. He said, the boat's going to be destroyed. So you read the story. The wind came, blew the boat up. It landed on a sand barge, and the nose got stuck. The wind comes, zoop, 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 and it's bending that boat. It's bending that ship, and finally the ship breaks. And Paul yelled for everybody to jump. He said, if you can't swim, grab a board. Everybody jumped out in the storm. Everybody got up on the island. Nobody was lost. What Paul said came true. See any miracles? No. Well, God one time talked to Jeremiah and he said, cannot I do with you as this potter? And he's talking about nations. He goes out to where there's a potter out there. And goes out and here he's making all these things. And most of us have seen Oliver and his pottery. And he'll make this, he'll do this and that. And if something goes wrong with the mud, well, he just takes it and slams it all together again, puts it in a ball and boom, flats it out, throws it back down, and starts over again. Well, I won't make a pitcher, I'll make a cup. Well, who gave Oliver the right to do that? It's Oliver. He can do whatever he wants to with that mud. God says, can I not do the same thing with you? Something to think about, isn't it? One time, God told Daniel, actually Nebuchadnezzar, he said that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men. He said, I'm the one that causes this. So he said, wow, God ruled in that heathen nation. Assyria was up there. And so he called on Assyria, God did, and he says, the rod of mine anger. And he explained to Syria, he said, you are a bad country. I'm going to use you to destroy Israel, and then I'm going to destroy you. He said, you're nothing more than just a whip that's in my hand that I'm going to use to whip my people with. Wow. Just normal stuff. Cyrus, 200 years before he was born, Isaiah prophesied, and God told him, he said, Cyrus shall perform my pleasure. He called this guy by name 200 years before he was born, and he became the king, and he turned all of the Jews loose and released them. How did he do that? Was there a miracle there? What all happened when we look at these things? Look at Esther, Ruth, Nehemiah, Ezra. On and on and on and on and on and on and on you go. I couldn't help but think this morning when I turned on the news at 8:30, great gigantic news. Egypt has a new ruler. And it just makes you cringe because the Islam party won. They will now control Egypt. And you say, boy, that's bad news. Yeah, I think it is. Something we sure didn't want to see happen. But then you kind of close your eyes and you go back and you think, Egypt, way back in the Old Testament, and how long has Egypt been here? Oh, longer than any of the others. Pharaoh after Pharaoh after Pharaoh. And here the other day a newsman said, the last guy that was just run out said he was actually the last Pharaoh. They've come to an end. And then we have a new election, and we have new people, and it's right before your eyes and my eyes, and it's 8:30 this morning. What will happen? I don't have the slightest idea. Why did God choose that government? I don't have the slightest idea. I don't know why he chose Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know why he chose Sennacherib. I don't have the slightest idea. But there's one thing I do know. I do know that in all this, God works in the kingdom of men. And I do know that God did all of these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things without performing miracles. And I do know that God takes the credit for it. And I do know that if you and I want to have the attitude that the Bible has, we've got to sit back and say, wow, does that apply to us today? That's what we're going to talk about next week. Think. And if each one of us will think for about 10 seconds is all it is, you can say, I've had strange things to happen in my life. Now, next week, we're going to talk about strange things in the affairs of ducks and men. Should you be here today and you understand that your life is not right with God, if you need to be washed in His precious blood, would you respond while we stand, while we sing?